I need you to know that I got suckered into another run. The deceit started Thursday night for me when my brother-in-law said, "Hey, do you want to go for a run tomorrow?" And I said, "Sure." And so he said, "Great, I'll meet you at Stone Mountain." I've been to Stone Mountain before, but I hadn't been to Stone Mountain, I guess. So I met him there at noon on Friday, which was not a cool hour, nor was it low in humidity at that time. But we met there, and we followed the Cherokee Trail, I think is the name of it. It's the one with the white squares that follow around the base of Stone Mountain that I've come to loathe. I think it's like a 5-mile trail. And so we got to the end of the 5-mile trail, and I was thinking, well, I'm doing okay. Sure, my brother-in-law had run 21 miles before I got there, but I kept up with him. So I was feeling pretty good. And then he said, "Okay, well, that's great that you're feeling good. We're not done yet." And so then we ran up Stone Mountain. And that's when I knew that I had really been deceived at a very deep level. And so we start running up, and we get to the part, that little hut that they have that I thought was like 80% of the way to the top. It would have been nice to stop at it because it's not 80% of the way to the top. It's like, 4 minutes into the hike. So we pass that, and then we get to that last summit where, the part, if you've been up Stone Mountain, you know the part of it. It's got the handrails because it's so steep it's not meant to walk. I get a little angry about it when I think about it, but we climbed that part. I thought my legs were going to murder me independently, but I eventually made it to the top of that. And when we get to the top of the part with the handrails, my brother-in-law looks at me and says, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, this isn't the top." That's what I thought. I thought, you're kidding me, right? I've been to Stone Mountain. I forgot that there was a false summit. That's what it's called. It's a false summit. When you get to the top of that super steep part, you are not at the top. You are still a long ways from the top. And so we got to the next super steep part. And you look at it and you're like, okay, now we're at the top. I got to the top, now we're at the top. It's a second false summit. There are 2 of them. And then we get to the top. We finally get to the top of that panoramic view. There's some wind blowing. It doesn't feel quite like the depths of Hades at this point. So I'm taking a breather, and he says, "All right, great. Well, now we just have to run down." Nobody told me that running down a mountain is harder than running up a mountain. That defies the laws of physics. I don't understand how that's possible, but I can tell you it's true. It's very true. Running down was incredibly hard. That day was a roller coaster for me. I thought it was going to be a good one, and then I got there and realized it was a bad one. And then I thought I was finished, and then I realized I wasn't finished. And then I thought I was going through the worst thing, and it turns out I wasn't going through the worst thing. And then I went through the worst thing, and that still wasn't the worst thing. It was a roller coaster of a day. And that's kind of the experience that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. This is kind of what the human experience is. It tends to be a kind of roller coaster. For some of us, it is a physical roller coaster where you feel like on Sunday morning your legs might just crumble. Like me right now. I'm not sure that I'll be able to make it to the end of this. But for some of us, it's not a physical challenge. It's very much an emotional or spiritual challenge. This is why we've been talking about the wilderness for the last couple of weeks, because we all know that our lives tend to run like that. It is a roller coaster. There are times when we think we've reached the end, or times when we think we've achieved a victory, only to realize the story's not over, only to realize a bigger challenge lays ahead. Right? All of us knows that experience. That's the power of looking at wilderness stories in Scripture. Because the same stories that play out in this book are the stories that play out in our lives. And when we can see more clearly how God is showing up in this story, we can see more clearly how God is showing up in our story. The question for us is not whether God's going to show up when things get really hard for us. We don't have to wonder, is God there? We don't have to wonder, is God listening? We don't have to wonder, is God with me? We know God is with me. We know God is with us. But the power of the wilderness is such that it blinds us and tends to erase our memory. It makes it so hard for us in the moment to see God clearly, to hear God clearly. That's why we need these stories. We need these stories not so that we can, win at Bible trivia. Nobody's counting that game. right? There's no Bible trivia that gets you into heaven. There's no Bible trivia that makes you a better Christian. The reason we learn the stories isn't so that we know more than the person next to us. The reason we learn the stories is they help us to see who God is. They help us to see how God shows up so that as we encounter our own wilderness, we can see more clearly. We know what to look for so that we can see how God is with us in those moments. Elijah knows that story well. If you're familiar with Elijah, he's an Old Testament prophet. The greatest prophet in Israel's history, aside from Moses and Jesus, is Elijah. He knows this roller coaster experience intimately, and the story that unfolds is one that I think has so much to teach us about exactly where we've been traveling through the wilderness. So I want to share with you out of 1 Kings this morning. 1 Kings is a phenomenal read. If you're not familiar with the Bible and you haven't read the Bible at all, 1 Kings would be a hilarious place to join in because it's so twisted and warped and it's entertaining and it's unexpected and the stories there are captivating. I'm not sure I would recommend that you start with 1 Kings, but you won't be bored by it if you do. A lot of 1 Kings starts with the story of Solomon. Solomon was King David's son. So we talked last week about David as in David and Goliath, the man who wrote Psalm 23. David has a son. Well, he has lots of sons, but that's also a different story. Solomon becomes king after David dies. Solomon's the greatest, most powerful, wealthiest king in Israel's history. He does some good things, he does some bad things, and he dies, kind of like most of our lives. After Solomon dies, the kingdom of Israel is divided into two kingdoms. This is a part of the story that we miss sometimes, and so it gets a little confusing when we're reading the Old Testament and it's talking about Israel and it's talking about Judah as though they're two different places, because they are. Israel is the northern kingdom. Judah is the southern kingdom. So the kingdom divides, and much of the rest of the kings, of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, is the story of all of the intrigue around who's going to be king, all of the intrigue around who the prophet is, all of the intrigue around how the people are following God or not following God. It's a fascinating story that I highly recommend to you. At one point, somewhere around Kings 15 or 1 Kings 15 or 16, we hear the story of Ahab and his wife come onto the scene. Ahab is one of the kings. He's not a very good king. He decides to marry a woman named Jezebel. That may be a name that you're familiar with. Jezebel is the absolute worst. We tend to try to make people look better in the Bible. She's the worst. You can't make her look better. She is just the worst. She's not even Jewish, which by Israelite law was not even legal, but the king of Israel is marrying a Gentile. The reason that he does so is actually a stroke of genius, and you got to admire this, because he marries Jezebel because she brings access to a great army. She's from towards the Mediterranean coast. The Phoenician army comes with her. She brings access to an economic reality that Israel did not have access to, so she was a really brilliant move on Ahab's part to marry. The problem with Jezebel is she brought with her wealth, military, and a few extra gods. And that turns out to be a problem. I don't know if you remember this part of the New Testament. I think it's in one of the Ten Commandments where God says, don't do that. Don't have other gods. I'm the only God. Only worship me. And yet Jezebel brings with her a whole host, like a pantheon of gods for every natural phenomenon that you can imagine. So there's a god for everything. And those gods, they behave erratically. You never know exactly what they're going to do. They have a little bit of ADD and ADHD. So they're constantly like just not paying attention. And so you have to get their attention. You got to wake them up. They fall asleep quite often, as it turns out. So you have to do things to wake them up. They use humanity as a slave race to provide for all of their needs. And in return, what humanity gets to do is beg them to help. And yet, somehow, Jezebel and her people continue to worship their gods. So when Jezebel marries Ahab, they decide to do something, again, kind of smart, super heretical, but kind of smart. They say, okay, well, let's create a two-track religion. Ahab says, all right, you can keep worshiping God, the God who brought you out of Egypt, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can keep worshiping the God who defeated the greatest nation on earth and the God who delivered you into the promised land. But let's also add some, because wouldn't that be fun? And in particular, Ahab says, you know, my wife's favorite God is named Baal. And Baal is the god of rain and lightning and thunder and wealth. And wouldn't it be great to just add on some of that? Because we need rain and lightning and thunder and wealth in order to survive as a people. So that's the system. It's a 2-track system in Israel. The people who are supposed to worship the one true God end up worshiping all kinds of different gods. So this is when Elijah comes onto the scene, somewhere in 1 Kings 16 or 17. And God sends Elijah to deliver this message. This is more the tone of the message than the content of it, but the tone is very much like this. God says to the people through Elijah, this is not a buffet. You don't get to just choose what you want. You don't get to just pick up a beef tenderloin and slap it on top of some Brunswick stew. You can't just pick and choose from all of these gods. You have to pick a lane. That's what Elijah says. You got to pick a lane. You can either worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or you can worship all the other gods, but you cannot do both. And to prove his point, God turns off the faucet. And for 3 years, there's no rain in Israel. The first 2 years is not that big of a problem, because the first year, you're eating last year's harvest, right? When you harvest food, you are going to store that for the next year. So the first year, you're eating last year's harvest. The second year of that drought, after God turns off the rain, the second year of that drought, you're eating the previous year's harvest, which was largely unaffected by that drought. It's the third year that you start to think, maybe we messed up. Perhaps if God is the God of life, if God is the God of provision, if God is the one who's leading us into the good life, and none of that exists for us now, perhaps we have messed up. At the end of that 3 years, Elijah gets a little bit fed up with all the prophets and priests of Baal, this rival god who isn't even a god, but people keep worshiping him as though he can do something about it. And so Elijah calls together all of Baal's prophets and priests, and he says, let's have a competition. Let's see whose God is more powerful. And so they meet in a place called Mount Carmel. We have a map of it. This is really bad timing with my son's display, but at least I don't have my laser pointer this morning. We have Mount Carmel up at the top. You can see it labeled up there. I think we've got it labeled. And there it is. And so this is where it's taking place, and that's important for this reason. This is the god Baal. That's his home turf. It turns out all these gods that Jezebel worships, they all are more present or more powerful in particular geographic locations. For the prophet Baal, Mount Carmel is the seat of his power because they get like 38, 40 inches of rain every year. It's right on the Mediterranean Sea. So they get tons and tons of rain, which must mean that the god Baal is very powerful in that place. Elijah says, I'll give you home field advantage. I'll come onto your turf, and we're gonna have a competition. So this is the way he sets it up. He says, look, you sacrifice an ox or a goat or a sheep or whatever it was. You make your sacrifice and put it on an altar. I'll make my sacrifice and I'll put that on an altar as well. And then you pray to your gods and see if your gods can light that sacrifice on fire. And I'll pray to my God and see if my God can light that sacrifice on fire. And for once and all, we will find out who is the most powerful God in this land. And so the prophets of Baal, remember the gods are a little bit ADD, they're a little bit hard to get their attention. So the prophets of Baal start to hop around and they start to dance around and they start to do all the things that they do, which are all weird. And you can just feel Elijah standing back laughing at them because Elijah knows there is no God Baal. Elijah knows they're doing something that makes absolutely no sense. Elijah stands back and lets them exhaust themselves because nothing happens. There is no God Baal that can light that thing on fire. So Elijah lets them play it out. And after they're exhausted, Elijah steps up and he prays to God. Oh, before he does that, Elijah does this. He has people dig a moat around his sacrifice. He digs a trench around the sacrifice and brings water up to the top of Mount Carmel, douses his sacrifice in water. There's so much water that the moat around the sacrifice is filled with water. There is no world in which anything in that sacrifice could light on fire because there was so much water covering it. Nothing could light on fire. Then Elijah steps up and he prays to God, who, of course, lights that sacrifice on fire. And in that moment, all of Israel sees it because they've gathered around. Israel has gathered around to see whose God is more powerful. Are we serving the right God? Are we worshiping the true God of life and the God of provision, the God who freed us? Or are we worshiping the Baal, who this Jezebel says is the one true powerful God? All of Israel sees Baal is nothing and God is everything. All of Israel sees that idolatry leads down the wrong path, and that worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the path to the good life. And so the people turn back towards God. And then Elijah sees a rain cloud growing in the Mediterranean Sea. And that rain cloud starts as big as a hand, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the whole land is drenched in a life-giving rain. He runs ahead of Ahab's chariot. I guess he's pretty quick. I don't know. Maybe he ran Stone Mountain 74 times. He runs ahead of Ahab's chariot to tell all the people the good news that the drought is over, that God is God, and we are his people. Everything is great. It is the highest height of Elijah's career. It is the greatest victory that he could imagine. He knows it's God's victory, but he played a part. It is the greatest outcome he could have imagined. And then Jezebel gets word. Because one of the things that Elijah does is Elijah kills all the prophets of Baal. We're not going to deal with that in today's sermon. I'm going to let you go deal with that later. But when Jezebel finds out that all of her priests and prophets that bring her all of the money are dead, she signs a warrant for Elijah's death. And Elijah gets so scared that he runs. And it's from that very moment that we see something that you and I know exactly, because we know what it's like when the wilderness is before us. We know what it's like when the challenge is before us. One of the first things that happen, we've talked about it for a couple weeks now, one of the first things that happens is that our memory is virtually erased. Think about what Elijah has just seen. Think about what God has just done through Elijah. And yet when he's faced with Jezebel's proclamation that if he's still alive tomorrow, then may the gods kill Jezebel. That's what she said. It's kind of funny. Go back and read it. When he's faced with that, he forgets immediately everything that God has done, everything that he has seen up to that moment in his life. And he takes off running. And he runs to a place called Beersheba. And Beersheba is important for a couple reasons. We've got that on the map as well. Beersheba is important for a couple reasons. One, it's the southern border of the kingdom of Judah. What Elijah does is run all the way to the other side of the country, hoping to get out of Jezebel's reach. It's like 70 miles. So maybe he has run. It's starting to feel more like Elijah was a long-distance ultramarathoner. But he runs 70 miles to Beersheba, the southern border. And he leaves his servant there, because the other thing that's important about Beersheba is it's on the edge of the wilderness. And what we hear as 1 Kings chapter 19 begins is that Elijah travels one day's journey into the wilderness, right? Into this place that lacks everything necessary for survival. And when he gets one day's journey out there, he leaves his servant behind. He's by himself. When he gets a day's journey into the wilderness, he lays down beneath some kind of shrub. And he says to God, I'm done. I've had enough. This is too much for me. He lays down and waits to die. It says he asks to die. He is so overcome with despair. He's so overwhelmed by fear that the only future he can imagine is death. He cannot see life in his future. Brothers and sisters, you know some of us have faced that wilderness. Some of us know what it's like to see only death in our future. Perhaps it's not you. Maybe it's a neighbor. Perhaps it's a family member. It is too common for those around us to be overcome with despair and to see only the size of the challenge in front of us. To be overcome with that kind of grief is a terrible thing. And so Elijah lays down beneath that bush and simply waits to die. And in that moment, an angel taps on his shoulders and says, eat and drink. Now remember, we're in the wilderness. The wilderness has no food, and it has nothing to drink. But there beside him when he wakes up is some loaves of bread that have been baked on the rocks. That's how hot it is. It's so hot out there that you can bake bread on the rocks. But miraculously, there's a loaf of bread and there is water there as well. And so he eats and he drinks and he falls asleep again. The angel shows up a second time and says, hey, Elijah, you need to eat this and you need to drink this because you don't have strength for the journey. And I love imagining what Elijah must have been thinking in that moment. What do you mean I don't have strength for the, how much worse can it get? You mean I'm not at the top yet? How much worse can it get? We know that feeling. But the angel of God has followed Elijah to that place. And remember, Elijah has run literally out of Israel. Elijah has allowed his fear and his despair to literally exile him from the promises of God. And he thinks he went there by himself. And what shows up in the depths of his despair is the presence of God saying, eat and drink. The journey isn't over yet. It says that Elijah gets up, eats the bread, drinks the water, and travels 40 days and 40 nights with no more food and water to a place called Mount Horeb. Now, when we hear the word Mount Horeb, our expectations are supposed to begin rising. But that name, Mount Horeb, may not be familiar to you. That same mountain, it says the mountain of God. This is where the angel sends Elijah 40 days, 40 nights later. The other name for Mount Horeb is Mount Sinai. We have that on the map as well. It's 250 miles south. Somehow, without the aid of food and drink, Elijah is carried to Mount Sinai. This is the same Mount Sinai to which God leads Moses on the way out of Egypt and on the way to the Promised Land. This is the same Mount Sinai where Moses ascends to the top and not only encounters God who gives him the path to the good life, we call it the law, but Moses encounters God face to face, and it transforms Moses' appearance. It's such an overwhelming experience for Moses that his skin glows when he goes down the mountain. It's kind of a weird story. Go back and read it. It's in Exodus 33, I think. So it's an overwhelming experience of God's presence. When we hear that Elijah is traveling to Mount Horeb, our expectations begin to rise because we know that God encounters his people in crisis at the top of Mount Horeb, at the top of Mount Sinai. So when he arrives there, he goes into the cave and he spends the night. And the next day, I want you to hear how the story unfolds. If you're following along, this is 1 Kings chapter 19. I'm going to start in verse 9. At that place, at that place he came to a cave and he spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" That's how I imagine it sounding. What are you doing here? You're not in Israel. You're not where I sent you. You're not in the place where the people need you. You're not in the place of our greatest victory. What are you doing here? Now, I don't know if that's exactly the tone. That's how I imagine it. Elijah answers, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. I've done everything for you, God." Listen to Elijah's response. "I've done everything for you. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They've done nothing for you, God. They're the worst kind of people. They have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars. They've stopped worshiping you. They've killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away. Isn't this what fear and despair do to us? They erase our memory and cloud our vision." Elijah has forgotten everything that God has done in his life, everything that God has done for Israel, and somehow believes the lie that he is alone. Somehow believes the lie that God has abandoned him. Because that's what the wilderness does to us. It shouts lies in our ears. And the lies sound a lot like, "What has God ever done for you? Where is your God now?" Elijah, in this moment of despair, hear this too. doesn't put on a performance for God, does he? Elijah doesn't, in this moment of despair, when he hears God say, "What are you doing here?" Elijah doesn't say, "Oh God, I'm just very faithful and I'm super glad to be here and thank you for bringing me to this place." He's not putting on a show. Elijah lets God into the depths of his soul. God, I'm alone. The people hate me. Death is my only future. Listen to what God says. God says, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." We could have anticipated that because that's what God does on Mount Sinai, on Mount Horeb. For the Lord is about to pass by. Now there's a great wind so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of sheer silence. It wasn't in the chaos raging around him that Elijah hears God's voice. It wasn't in the earthquake. It wasn't in the fire. It wasn't in the wind. It was in the sheer silence that Elijah finally hears the word of God coming to him. This is what God says. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and he stood at the entrance to the cave, and then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered with the same words that he said before, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword." I think that's probably what Elijah sounded like, actually. "And I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And then the Lord said to him, "Go. Return to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you're going to anoint this guy king. And then a little bit later on, you're going to anoint the next prophet. His name is Elisha." And then he ends by saying, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. You are not alone." What God says in the sheer silence, after the chaos rages around him, what God tells Elijah is, "I am not done." What God says to Elijah is, "I am not finished with you, and I am not finished with your people. I am not finished with my people." What God says to Elijah is, "You are not alone. Everybody hasn't forsaken me. Everybody hasn't left you alone. Not only am I with you, Elijah, but you have a people, you have a community that will stand beside you." What Elijah hears in this critical moment is the voice of God saying, "I'm not done yet. And I'm going to go with you. And I'm going to go with you into the wilderness of Damascus to anoint the king, to name the next prophet, and to be a part of a community who hasn't forgotten about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of liberation, the God of freedom, and the God of promise. I have not forgotten." If last week, as we explored Psalm 23, what we heard was that in the wilderness, sometimes we need to lift our eyes from the challenge in front of us to the shepherd who's leading us, I think part of what we hear from Elijah's story is that in those moments of chaos, in those moments of noise that drowns everything out, we wait. We wait until it passes, and we listen. We listen for that sheer silence in which God's voice cries out to us and says, "I'm not finished yet." Some of you have read the book or heard about the book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. I wonder for us, friends, if we need the ruthless elimination of noise in our lives. When you find yourselves deep in the wilderness, not on the edge of the wilderness like Elijah was at first, but when we find ourselves deep in the wilderness, all the way at Mount Sinai, I wonder if what we need to do is to eliminate the noise that's lying to us, the noise that tells us, what has God done for you? The noise that tells us, You know, you're the only one that thinks this. The noise that tells us, you know, you really are by yourself. I wonder if what we need to do is eliminate that noise, put ourselves in front of God at the entrance to that cave and allow God to pass by and allow God to speak words of not just wisdom, but words of grace, words of love, and words of healing over us as he calls us to continue the journey, because he's not finished yet. Even in the depths, even in the darkest day is not the last day. God is not finished.